So today we're going to make a chocolate cream pie. Two components to that. The one we're going to do first, which is our pâte sablée, which is a very versatile, super handy crust. Pâte sablée uses confectioner sugar, so we use it for sweet crusts, for tarts and pies and stuff like that. You can also make cookies out of it. Like a diamant cookie, for example, would be made out of a pâte sablée. So this is a very simple, very fast and easy recipe. The ingredients are 75 grams of confectioner sugar, 25 grams of almond flour, then we've got 2 grams of salt and 240 grams of AP flour. These are all going to get put into your food processor. We're using a Roku here, but a home food processor will work just fine for this recipe. You just want to have one with a blade to cut the butter into the flour very quickly. Then we're going to put in 113 grams of butter. This is going to be cut into about half-inch pieces, and then that will be using the sablage method, so sand it into the flour first. By doing that, we're going to create very little gluten development in the flour, which is what we want for this recipe. It's a very short crust. So we're doing a few things to maximize that. One is we're replacing some of the flour with almond flour, so it's going to give it a little bit of taste. It's also going to help prevent too much gluten from forming when we're working with it. By cutting in the butter before we add any significant amount of water to it, remember there's a little bit of water in this butter. This is 84% butter. So it's going to have a higher fat content than what you typically find at the grocery store. Unless you buy European butter, that's usually 82 to 84% at the grocery store. So it works fine with either one. You don't have to get this special butter. So we're going to cut that into like a cornmeal size, sort of like what we did last week when we made our mealy pie dough. And then the last thing that we're going to do once we get to that mealy texture is we're going to add in 1 egg. The egg is going to provide all the water for the dough to bring it together. So remember, the egg white is about 90% water, and the yolk is about 50% water. So in addition to adding a little structure and flavor, this is providing all the binding that we need, the water to develop the dough and bring it together as much as it's going to. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with our confectioner sugar and our almond flour. And we're going to just dump these in here. And we're just going to pulse this just for a few seconds to mix them together. Because the Roku has a big hole on the top and the confectioner sugar gets very dusty, I'm going to just cover it up while I'm mixing to keep a lot of excess dust from coming into the air. All right, and that's really all we need to do. And I'm going to add in my salt. Try to do this quickly so we don't get too much dust. And then I'm going to add in my AP flour. And then we're going to just spritz this again. Now I'm going to cut my butter. So, like I said, you want this in about half-inch pieces, just so that it incorporates a lot more quickly. And I like to kind of break it up a little bit and get it into the flour just so it incorporates a lot more easily. All right. At this point, I'm looking for a very sandy texture, like I said. So I'm going to just go ahead and stop that. See how we're doing here. So this actually feels perfect. It's sort of a cornmeal consistency, very, very small pieces of butter. You can just barely feel them in there. So this is perfect. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my egg, crack it in here. And now I'm just going to process it until it comes together into a ball. So it doesn't take very long. All right, now I'm going to stop it just short. And I'm going to show you an additional technique. This isn't really necessary, but sometimes you might want to use this technique. So this is called frissage. Remember, this blade is very sharp, so be careful with it. And if you're walking around the kitchen with it, you treat it like you're holding a knife. All right, so the idea behind frissage, which means to smear, is that you're working the dough just a little bit. You can see that I left this just a little bit dry, just to show you that we can finish it with this technique. Or if you maybe you're making a larger batch and you want to put some dye in some of it and not another, maybe put some cocoa powder in some of it, you can use this technique to integrate into some of that flour. Again, because we cut the butter in first and we're using the almond flour, there's really no chance that you're going to overwork this dough unless you really go crazy. So traditionally frissage, you use the palm of your hand and you're smearing the dough forward like this. The other way that you can do it, which is the way that I like to do it, is just to use your bench scraper. For one thing, you're not putting additional heat into the dough, which is going to start melting the butter. And also, it's just a lot faster and easier, I find. So take your bench scraper and you want to push down pretty hard, just a little bit at a time, and you're just smearing this dough towards you and collecting it up on your bench scraper. If it gets to be a little much on your bench scraper, you can just kind of peel it up, set it aside, and then finish the amount that you have left. All right. Now I'm going to collect this all up. And we just need to make a disc out of it, wrap it in cellophane, and then we're going to put it in the fridge for at least an hour, but ideally 2 or 3 hours, or you can do overnight if you want. And that's going to allow the dough to fully hydrate. So you want your disc to be somewhat circular in shape, and like I said, about 3/4 to an inch thick. That way it'll chill more quickly, and also when you want to use it, it'll be easier to get it to start rolling out. If you do it into a ball, it's going to take longer for the cold to get in, and also it's going to be harder for you to get it into an even disc shape that we're going to need to roll out our tart. So I'm going to go wrap this now and put it in the fridge. All right, this is what we've got. All right, so I'm going to clean up here. You guys start using your ingredients and we'll get that all together. I'll come around and help you guys, and then we'll learn how to make the custard next. That feels good.
Good.
Yeah. So if you're comfortable cracking it directly in there without it getting shelled, then go for it. And if not, you can do it in here and pour it in.
I'll give it a try.
Why don't you crack it on here, just in case it does that. And when you have when you're breaking an egg into a bowl, especially if it's the first one, crack it as close to the bowl as you can, because if it drops down, the yolk is likely to break. For this, it doesn't matter so much, other than it'll be harder to get it out of the bowl. But in a lot of stuff that we do, we want to separate the yolks and the whites, so it's just a good habit of always doing it that way. One little tiny piece of butter that. So this is a pound of butter, 453.6 grams, which divided by 4 is 113. So if you have one like this, you can cut it long ways and then turn it and cut it, and you'll have 113 pieces. But when you buy butter at the grocery store, it comes in sticks that are 113 grams. So that's part of the reason that I scaled this way. It just makes it really easy. You just take one stick of butter, one egg, put it in, super easy.
I was trying to cut it. There was like the one wrapped in, and it was like literally like precisely 226. I was like, okay, let me just like cut it in half. And I was like wondering, I was just by chance.
And you'll see a lot of recipes that are like that. Like you'll see the number 113 a lot, not just for butter, but for lots of stuff, because it's a quarter of a pound. And so lots of recipe writers, and the reason that also that happens a lot is, like, you know what pound cake is, right?
I've had it before. I don't know how to make it.
So pound cake is butter and eggs and flour and sugar, pound of each. So if you have a recipe like that, and you know, which is a pound of something, and it's a commercial amount of it, and you scale it down for home use, you might cut it in quarters, and you end up with 113 or 227, which is, you know, it's not exactly 113. So around it, if it's 2, it's 227. Anyway, that's why you see those numbers a lot. How are you guys doing?
I finished that part.
Okay.
I haven't tried it yet.
And then you got distracted chatting.
Well, sorry, my husband just called. He had to go. Nothing important, right? Yeah, exactly.
So when you do this, you want to really smear it with some force.
Does this work for? This doesn't work for other types of pie dough? Like if you have a crumbly pie dough?
No. I mean, this is pie dough, so if you're making something that's really short like this, and because again the almond in it is extra short,
Yeah.
then you can use the frissage method for something like that. But like for the brisée that we made last week,
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to use this technique. It's going to basically burn the dough, so it's going to, I think we talked about this last week.
Yeah.
It's like making a beurre marnier.
Yeah.
So it's not going to work as a dough. But this is super short. I've made this where I've done, like I've used it for things where I'm doing a pattern of different colors, and stripes or checkerboard or something like that. And so I've done this a lot to really get the dye fully integrated into it, and it's just fine. So.
Chef, can you try my breads right now?
Sure.
Right behind you. Okay, so I'm having a problem, and I don't know, maybe I'm over, sorry, this is maybe I am over, or maybe my proofing is too hot. I'm putting it by the fireplace, and I'm wondering if, because I start out and it's not as sticky, and by the end of like the 4th or 5th foil or whatever, fold, it's completely sticky, and then it just falls flat.
So you're probably getting it too hot, and also, depending on what it's in, you know, fires are radiant heat, so they're going to be overheating the outside, and not. So you really want to have it just in an area that's warm, without any radiant heat getting into it.
Okay, and then
All right, so now we're going to take our dough that's been chilling and resting, and we're going to use the sheeter to roll it out very quickly. I find this a little easier than the way that we did it last week. So first thing I'm going to do is just get a little bit of flour on the sheeter. And with some doughs, you want to roll them out just a little bit at a time. With the sablée, it actually works best if you do it like 5 millimeters at a time, and it'll compress it a little bit. So first thing I'm going to do is just make sure my roller is set correctly. And then I'm going to turn it. And each time I'm going to turn it and just kind of make sure it's not sticking. We don't want it to stick to the roller, and we don't want it to stick to the table either, the canvas. So you can throw a little bit of flour underneath if you feel like it might need a little bit. And then I'm going to take this and take it down a little ways. And turn it over. Now I'm going to do this down to just about 3 millimeters. Which is all that we need for this dough. Perfect. Now I'm going to take my sheet pan. If you want, you can use a rolling pin to roll it on like the way that we showed you last week. This just makes it a little bit easier to transport it without the risk of tearing it. And we don't have to worry about a few of the cracks around the outside because this is a much bigger piece than we actually need, so we'll be just fine. This is kind of similar to what we did before. We're going to take this, and you can see we have way more than we need, right? So that's why I wasn't so worried about the exact shape of it. You could have made it a little bit wider, a little more circular, but this fits on the sheet pan really easily, so it's just this is kind of a good shape for what we're doing. So I'm going to just kind of use this to eyeball how big that I need, and we don't need a lot of overlap on this, so I'm going to kind of do this much. So I'm going to just kind of cut a rough circular shape out of here.
Why didn't you just put the pie plate down on it?
Just to kind of eyeball, you know, what size I need.
So if you put it down, face down, and smush the dough, is that why you're not just setting it on the dough?
I'm not putting it on because then it'll stick and it'll be hard to get off, and then you'll kind of ruin it. So yeah, I mean, you can hold it here if you want. It's better to be a little bit too much than too little, because you can always cut it smaller. The other nice thing about sablée is that it's because it's so short and just the way it is, you know, like I said before, you can't really overwork it. So you can just ball this up, and I'll have you guys do this, and then you can use this, you can roll this out again and make something else out of it. So we're gonna have a lot of this left over, and I'll give it to Chef Dan for his class to use. So now I'm gonna just take this and put it in my pie tin. And then the other thing with sablée, we're going to do this the same way we did the other one. If you tear it, or there's like a hole in it, and you can just take a piece and patch it up, and no one will ever know. It's not like, you know, with the brisée, it's a little, you know, or some of them are really kind of hard to work with. And I'm doing this, you know, kind of quickly, but it's very easy to work with. It's very forgiving. If I want a little bit more, I can do that easily. But I want to show you a different way of crimping. There's a lot of crimping methods out there. Maybe in the pumpkin pie, I'll show you a different one as well. But, you know, for this, I'm just going to fold a little bit under here. If you want more dough on the outside, you can cut it a little bit bigger. You could also cut it like an inch or more, and then use scissors to trim it down to what you want. So you can see here, I tore this a little bit, so I can fix that later. And then I'm just going to kind of get it somewhat even all the way around. And take my little extra and just stick a little bit in there. I did this on purpose just so you could see how you can fix stuff. All right, so now we have our, you know, if I was doing this for selling it, I would take my time a little bit more, but, you know, it's just you guys, so. All right, now, take my fork and just dip it in a little bit of flour, and I'm gonna press it down at like a 45-degree angle, and then you can usually get 2 out of here, and then I'm going to press it down here so that you guys can see that, so that these 2 come together. And then I'm just going to go around the whole pie.
Why do you score the crust?
What's that?
Why do you do that to the crust? Why do you score the crust? Like, just for pattern aesthetics, or is there a purpose of scoring?
Well, there's 2 reasons that we crimp. One of them is for looks, and the other is by pressing down, it helps it stick so that it doesn't shrink in when you're cooking it. So, yeah.
You said that we add almond flour to the mix in order to prevent gluten. Why is that? What is there like? Does almond flour have something that makes it not develop as much gluten compared to AP flour?
Well, because there's no gluten in it. Almond flour is just ground almonds, so there's no gluten at all. So you're replacing some of the flour. You know, it's like if you make bread, which you guys hopefully are all doing every single day, and rather than using wheat flour, you use rye flour. You know, rye flour, it doesn't have gluten, but it has similar high molecular weight proteins in it, but they don't form that network like gluten does. They're very weak. So the more you put in, the less gluten you're going to develop. So if you want to make something that has less gluten development, you could use an alternate flour, or you could, like if you have a recipe that calls for pastry flour or cake flour, and because you want it to be really tender, and you only have AP flour at home, you can replace some of the flour with cornstarch. So cornstarch is just starch, there's no protein in it. Flour, you know, wheat flour is a similar starch with protein. So you're making your own pastry flour by having more starch in it and less protein. You're just changing that. So anything that you can do that is a sort of flour replacement that doesn't develop as much gluten, that will make it what we call shorter. And we call it shorter because you're not really shortening the gluten, but you're not allowing the gluten to develop as much. And there's a lot of ways that we can control gluten development. Fat is a big one. So because we cut the butter into here first, the fat is coating the proteins is coating the flour. And so if we put the fat in first, it's really hard for the proteins to develop. Their disulfide bonds, or chemical bonds in between them that forms the gluten. So if you make brioche, for example, brioche is a very highly enriched bread that has a lot of butter in it, and egg yolks, which are also a lot of fat in egg yolks. You need to develop the gluten first, and if you don't, and if you put the butter in too early, you're never going to develop the gluten because it's never going to be able to form. And when we talk about bread a little bit later, we'll talk about some of this as well, because bread, you want to have a lot of gluten development. And so part of that is using bread flour, which has more protein in it than like AP flour or pastry flour or other kinds of flour. But there are things that hinder the gluten development even in bread that's a lean dough that only has flour and salt and water, and then whatever kind of, whether natural yeast or commercial yeast. So if you do the bastonnage that we talked about, where you hold back some water, and we're doing this in your recipe, the reason that we do that is because we're developing the gluten before we add a lot of water. Once you add all the water, it's harder for the gluten to develop. So it makes it easier for you guys to develop the gluten first and then add the rest of the water in. If you have a very, very sticky dough, like if you do an 80% hydration dough and you put all the water in the beginning, you can do it, but it's really hard. And it takes a lot of, you need to have a lot of experience with regular bread first and kind of get it down and be comfortable with it before you move to the higher hydration doughs. Our dough is pretty high hydration. It's over 77, it's like 77.2%. So that's pretty high as bread. Usually people start with about a 70% hydration for bread, but because of the method that we're using, you may not believe me yet, but hopefully by the end of this class you'll all have great success with it. It works really well and it's pretty easy to master. It just takes a few times of kind of doing it and seeing how well developed it is and what it feels like. One of the questions that I was asked tonight is what to do if you're at your 5th fold and it's still growing all over the place. And the answer is you can just do a couple more folds. Right? There's nothing that says you have to stop at 5. If it feels like it's not developed enough, develop it more and do extra folds. Spend some time with it. If you really need it. Just work it to develop the gluten until it gets to the point where you're happy with it. And if it's not, if it still just feels like it's really wet, bake it and it will probably taste delicious even though it may not rise as much. I promised one of you, I don't remember who, that they asked a question, I was going to tell a story of what happened to me last week. And so I'm close to the end now, and so I'm going to just try to do, so that the pattern kind of comes together. So I'm going to change my angle just very slightly so that I get my pattern. So this is it. This took a long time because I was talking so much, but you can see it's very fast, it's very easy, it looks really nice, but it's very easy to do. And because I'm pressing it down onto the pie thing, it's going to hold it in place a little bit better. So when you guys do this next week, I want to get in here, get it sheeted out right away, because we want to chill it for about half an hour before we put it in the oven. It's going to bake for 25 to 30 minutes in the oven, and then as soon as it's baked, we can fill it. It doesn't have to cool down because what we're putting in is going to be hot. So You know, you might let it cool for just a few minutes, but you don't have to worry about letting it fully cool down. It's not like we're frosting a cake that's hot out of the oven. So anyway, I kind of raced through this, but it came out, you know, looking all right. So I think you guys will have good success with this next week. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you my very sad story. Actually, it's not a sad story. Last week, some of you guys were having some trouble with the bread, and so I thought, oh, I'll just make one, like make it most of the way, bring it in, I can show you guys some stuff. And I was in the middle of doing a million things in the morning, and so I made my pre-ferment overnight. It was beautiful, like really nice. And then I mixed my dough, my autolyse. I put in my 700 grams of water and put my 200 grams of the pre-ferment in and kind of mixed it all nicely. And then I put in my 700 grams of flour. And then I, mixed it in and covered it up. And then I came back an hour later and it was super wet. And I'm like, what is going on here? And then I realized, I put in, my brain was just, so I put in 700 grams of flour rather than 1,000 grams of flour. So it was super wet. And I hadn't done the bassinage yet, so I took my salt and my water and I put in the rest of the flour then. And then, I didn't want to bring it in for you guys and show, because it was not right. So instead, I just did the mix and I put it in the refrigerator and I did it was at least 2 days ferment without any fulls. I just did my final mix and then I fermented it for 2 or 3 days. So it was very acidic. And then I did the rest of the folds and it clearly needed more folds. It was the gluten wasn't developed very well. When bread is very acidic, that also interferes with gluten development. And so if you ferment your bread for a really long time, it's going to be harder to work with. That's part of the reason also I have you guys do a pretty short ferment on these first ones so that it's easier for you guys to work with and have success. Once you do that and kind of get it down, then you can start playing with higher hydrations, longer ferments, a higher mixture of whole wheat flour in it and things like that. So I decided to bake it, but rather than baking 2 loaves of bread, I took half of it and I made a focaccia out of it. And then the other half I just did a normal boule and baked it. And I did the best that I could with the shape that it was in. And so it didn't rise up as much as it should have, but it was delicious and the focaccia was delicious. The focaccia was not focaccia, like I didn't do a real focaccia recipe. I just sort of put all the olive oil in. I did a lot of steps the way I would if I was making focaccia. So it didn't rise up again as much as focaccia should, but it was super delicious. The bread was really delicious, and it was a bread that any of you guys would have been happy to eat. I should have brought some in for you guys to taste. It's really good. So any of the bread that you guys make, bake it. Just do the best that you can. Try to develop the gluten as much as you can. If it's really wet, score it really quickly. It's going to be a lot harder to score when it's really wet. And if it's really, really wet, you don't even need to score it because it's going to open up without scoring because you don't have a skin on it. The skin is what keeps it from opening up. And don't feel bad, it's a learning process, and just do the best you can to get in the oven quickly, bake it, and I can pretty much guarantee you it's going to be delicious. One of you guys, brought in that bread a week or 2 ago, and it didn't rise up right and whatever, but it was really delicious. So, it was bread that I would definitely eat. It's a learning process. You just got to do it, and the more you do it, you'll kind of get the hang of it, and then you can ask me all your more complicated questions. All right, so I'm going to get this in to the fridge.
Why do we chill it before baking?
That's a good question. So you want to chill it before you bake because it's not going to spread as much if you chill it. And some people will freeze it before they bake it. It will get in the oven, and because it's very cold, it's going to set the structure on the outside before it has a chance to melt the fats too much. If we put this in the oven right now, we could do this and ruin it as an experiment, but it's going to totally shrink and melt, and it won't be good at all. But if I put it in the freezer for like half an hour right now, It'll be 7:30. And then we put it in the oven. So yeah, we could do it tonight. So we can either do that, or I can just freeze it and we can bake it next week. And well, let's do that. We'll bake it next week, put the custard in it. All right, let me get this in the fridge, and then I want to finish the bread lecture so that we can try to get through the rest of that, answer all the rest of your questions on bread, and then I want to see lots of bread next week from all of you guys. And we'll try. And did you get yours out of the oven?
I did. I put it on the table.
Okay, so we'll try that as well. Why is this pre-ferment different from all other pre-ferments? Pot fermenté. Think about how pot fermenté is different, fundamentally different from every other pre-ferment that you would use for making bread.
That's gluten buildup, or?
Well, they'll all have gluten buildup. When you guys make your pre-ferment, so you take your starter and then you mix it all together and it's just a shaggy, sticky mess, right? And then the next day, it's still sticky, but it's like it's not getting on your hands. It's very stretchy, but it kind of stays together. That's because the gluten's developing on its own in there. Pot fermenté is made from dough, and dough has an ingredient in it that other pre-ferments don't. Salt. So that's the only difference between pot fermented, well, that's not the only difference, but that's like a fundamental difference, is that it's salt in it and there's not salt in any other pre-ferment. And then I have a little video that shows a biga versus a Polish versus a pot fermenté. Now, which one do you think is going to rise the most and the fastest? Polish, that's a good guess. So the pot fermenté, you know, you've already developed the dough completely. It's very healthy. There's a lot of stuff integrated that's going on. So it's going to rise really quickly. And then the Polish and then the biga.
But my pre-ferment, as I mentioned earlier, overnight I think it was too cold, so it didn't really rise. It wasn't really bubbling. It initially didn't float. Mm-hmm. So I think the pre-ferment wasn't fully developed.
Yeah, so if your pre-ferment isn't super active, but you want to make it anyway, you need to, I would probably, before you do your retard, I would let it ferment at room temperature to give it time to develop what you didn't develop when you made your pre-ferment.
Right.
And that's probably, because, you know, it looked like it was starting to get gassy. If your pre-ferment is not developed enough, that can cause flatbreads. If it's overdeveloped, probably less so. I would rather have it be where it's risen and then fallen, rather than that it's not risen yet. If your ferment is too short of a time, it'll be flat. If it's too long of a time, it'll also be flatter. But at least if it's for a long of time, it'll be very flavorful, right? So I'd rather err on that side for the flavor.
You can retard it for multiple days.
You can. But if you do, it's not going to rise as much. The other thing that we're going to want to do is dock it, and then we're going to blind bake this. So we're going to do the first bake with, just like we did last week, with parchment paper and beans in it. And then we're going to do that for about 15 minutes. We're going to take the parchment out, and then we're going to bake it again. And because we're going to put in custard in here and it's not going to get baked again, we'll be able to cook it to the perfect amount, just lightly brown, all the way around, and then we don't have to worry about how much is going to get cooked, like when we make a pie that needs to be par baked and then put back in the oven. So I'm going to take my fork and just dock this. You want to make sure that you dock the sides as well, all the way around. And our custard is very thick, so we don't have to worry about it coming through the holes in here. But if you're par baking something and you want to put a very runny filling into it, like maybe a quiche, then there's a few ways you can do it depending on what you're making. You can take egg wash and put it in when it's hot out of the oven, and that will seal all the holes. You could also, if you're making something sweet, you could maybe put some chocolate, either regular chocolate or white chocolate, which is just cocoa butter with milk solids and sugar in it. And any of those techniques will seal this. Now we're going to take this, some people sometimes crumple it up, and we're going to fill it with our beans. These beans have seen a lot of use in their time. And what's important here is that we're not just filling the bottom, we actually want to put beans all the way up the sides as well, and that will keep the sides from shrinking down and falling in. So I don't have to worry about having a mound in the middle. I just want to make sure that this is up the sides. All right, so now we're going to take out the beans. I like to do about a 2-to-1 of egg yolks to cream for stuff like this. You can make it a little thinner, you can use whole eggs. Lots of different people have lots of different ways of doing egg wash. So I'm just going to eyeball this here, but this is about maybe 18 grams of egg yolk. And then I like to use the pastry brush to break it up and mix it together. Just a lot faster and easier, and you're going to use the brush anyway. When I separated my yolk, I pulled off the colazy, which I like to do, so we don't have any bits of that in here. And then I'm just going to do kind of a not too thick egg wash on here. Parts where I started, I'll go back over again. And this will give it a little bit of shine and a little bit more color when we bake it. Just want to make sure there's not any dry spots because that will brown a little unevenly. All right, so I'm going to put this back in the oven now, and then we will bake it for another maybe 12-15 minutes. We'll have to wait. You want it to be completely dry and pretty evenly browned when you take it out of the oven.
I think we did it.
So did anyone have any difficulties with anything tonight that I don't know about? So one thing that I know, I mean, because we were all taking turns sheeting, it took a long time. Some of the sablée got a little too warm. So you really want to have it be pretty chilled when you work with it. If it's starting to get all soft, just put it in the fridge for a few minutes. And the same thing if you're working with any kind of like laminated pastry, or like the brisée that we made a few weeks ago. If it's ever getting too soft, just stick it in the fridge because it likes to be kept cold and it's a lot easier to work with. It will not tear nearly as easily. You can pick it up and move it and handle it a little bit without worrying about it tearing. How did that go? Is anybody as stressed as I am? I will say they all looked great. I was really pleased with the way that the shells came out. They all were beautifully browned. I didn't see any that looked problematic. You know, I don't know if you got a chance to see them all of you, but they were all very different and lots of different pie tins and so forth. But they were all baked really nicely. The bottoms were all fine. The tops are all nicely browned. So you guys did a great job with that. The custards all looked pretty good. Some were smoother than others. One team we used actually two teams used a immersion blender. So those will be extra. Actually, I'm gonna grab mine real quick.
Bye.